Hey everyone, and welcome back to Key Safety Talks.
Yeah.
Today we're tackling a hazard that's often overlooked,
Mm.
but can have a huge impact on your life.
Hmm.
Noise in the workplace.
Yeah.
We're going to explore how noise can lead to hearing loss and what you need to know to stay safe.
It's surprising how many people think hearing loss is just a part of getting older.
Yeah,
But the truth is, it's often entirely preventable, especially in the workplace.
that's right.
Yeah.
Our sources highlight that noise-induced hearing loss is actually the most common occupational illness in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Millions of workers
Right.
are exposed to hazardous noise levels every day.
Yeah.
And the crazy part is, even with OSHA regulations,
Right.
this has been a problem for decades.
It really underscores the importance of understanding the risks
Yeah,
and taking proactive steps to protect your hearing.
for sure.
But before we dive into the regulations,
Okay.
let's start with the basics.
Okay.
What exactly is noise and how do we measure it?
Well, from what I've gathered, noise is essentially unwanted sound that travels in waves of pressure.
Right.
And we measure those waves in decibels, or dB.
Exactly.
And-
But here's where it gets interesting. The decibel scale isn't linear, it's logarithmic,
But-
meaning a small increase in decibels can actually represent a huge jump in sound intensity.
So it's not just a gradual increase in volume, it's more like an exponential leap, right?
Precisely.
Okay.
For every 5 dB increase, the perceived loudness doubles. That means going from 85 dB to 90 dB isn't a minor change. Your exposure is twice as intense.
Wow, that puts it into perspective.
Yeah.
So even seemingly small changes in decibel levels can have a big impact on our hearing. But how does noise actually damage our ears?
To understand that, we need to take a quick look at how the ear works.
Okay.
Imagine the ear as a 3-part system. The outer ear collects sound waves and funnels them to the middle ear, where the eardrum vibrates.
Okay, so the eardrum is like the first point of contact for those sound waves.
Right.
What happens next?
Those vibrations are then passed on to 3 tiny bones in the middle ear,
Okay.
the malleus, ensayicus, and stapes.
Right.
These bones amplify the vibrations and send them to the inner ear, where the real magic happens.
The inner ear. That's where the cochlea is, right?
Yeah.
That spiral-shaped structure I saw in one of our sources.
You got it.
Okay.
The cochlea is filled with fluid and lined with thousands of tiny hair cells. These hair cells are super sensitive
Okay.
and convert those vibrations into electrical signals,
Right.
which travel to the brain, and that's how we perceive sound.
So it's like a chain reaction.
Mm-hmm.
Sound waves to vibrations to electrical signals, and finally, our brain interprets those signals as sound.
Exactly.
What happens when those hair cells get damaged by loud noise?
That's where the trouble starts.
Right.
These hair cells are incredibly delicate and can be damaged by prolonged exposure to loud noise.
Right.
And unfortunately, unlike other cells in our body, they don't regenerate.
Oh, no.
Once they're gone for good.
So all those times I cranked up the music without earplugs. Yikes.
Yeah.
Thinking back to that ringing sensation you get after a loud concert, is that a sign of hair cell damage?
It could be. That ringing or muffled hearing is called a temporary threshold shift, or TTS.
Okay.
It's a warning sign that your ears have been overloaded.
Uh-huh.
Luckily with TTS, your hearing usually returns to normal after some quiet time.
Okay.
But if you keep exposing yourself to loud noises over and over again...
That's when it can lead to permanent damage and irreversible hearing loss,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Okay.
It's called a permanent threshold shift, or PTS.
Alright.
And it's the hallmark of noise-induced hearing loss.
That's pretty scary.
Yeah.
It makes you realize how important it is to protect your hearing, especially on the job.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And that's why OSHA has specific regulations in place
Yeah.
to help prevent noise-induced hearing loss in the workplace.
Let's talk about those regulations.
Okay.
What exactly does OSHA require when it comes to noise in the workplace?
The foundation of OSHA's approach is the Hearing Conservation Program.
Okay.
This program has to be put into action by employers when noise exposures reach or exceed a certain level.
And what's the trigger point for this program?
It's called the action level,
Okay.
and it's set at an 8-hour time-weighted average, or TWA,
Okay.
of 85 decibels.
Okay, so if my average noise exposure over an 8-hour workday is out or above 85 dB, my employer needs to implement a hearing conservation program.
That's right.
What exactly does that program entail?
Well, there are several key elements,
Okay.
starting with noise monitoring.
Okay.
Employers are required to regularly monitor noise levels in the workplace to identify areas where employees might be exposed to noise at or above the action level.
Right.
They can't just guess.
Right.
They need to actually measure the noise levels.
So what tools do they use to do that?
There are two main tools: sound level meters and noise dosimeters.
Okay.
A sound level meter is like a snapshot. It measures the intensity of sound at a specific moment.
Okay, so that gives a reading at a particular point in time, but what about tracking exposure throughout the day?
That's where the dosimeter comes in.
Okay.
Workers wear it,
Right.
and it tracks their noise exposure over time, giving a much more personalized picture of their actual exposure,
Right.
especially if they move between areas with different noise levels.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So we have monitoring to identify potential problems.
Right.
What happens next?
Well, after the monitoring is done,
Yeah.
and if it shows that some employees are exposed to noise levels at or above the action level,
Yeah.
the employer needs to notify those employees.
So transparency is key here.
Yes.
Employees need to know what they're being exposed to.
Right.
What else is included in the hearing conservation program?
The next crucial component is audiometric testing.
Okay.
This involves hearing tests
Mm.
to assess an employee's hearing and track any changes over time.
So we're talking about regular hearing checks.
Exactly.
Oh.
First, there's a baseline audiogram, which establishes an employee's initial hearing levels
Okay.
before they start working in a noisy environment, or within 6 months of starting.
Okay.
Then they need to have annual audiograms to monitor for any changes,
Right.
especially signs of noise-induced hearing loss.
Are there any special requirements for these tests?
Absolutely.
Okay.
To ensure accuracy,
Right.
audiograms need to be conducted by qualified professionals,
Mm-hmm.
and the equipment needs to be properly calibrated.
Okay.
Plus, there's a 14-hour quiet period before the test
Right.
to minimize any temporary shifts in hearing that could affect the results.
No loud concerts the night before your hearing test.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Employers also need to keep those audiometric test records on file to track changes over time and evaluate the effectiveness of the hearing conservation program.
So we have monitoring,
Yeah.
audiometric testing.
Right.
What else is part of this program?
Another critical element is training.
Okay.
OSHA requires employers to provide comprehensive training to all employees
Okay.
who are exposed to noise at or above the action level.
Okay, so educating workers about the risks is a must.
Yeah.
What specific topics are covered in this training?
It starts with explaining the effects of noise on hearing,
Okay.
really driving home the point that this is serious stuff.
Right.
The training also needs to cover the different types of hearing protection devices available,
Mm-hmm.
how to choose the right type for their job,
Right.
how to fit them correctly,
Okay.
and how to use and care for them.
Because even the best hearing protection won't work if it's not used properly.
You got it.
Right.
And of course, the training should also cover the purpose and procedures of audiometric testing. We want employees to understand that those tests are there to protect their hearing,
Right.
not to punish them.
It's about empowering them to take an active role in protecting their hearing.
Exactly.
Right.
And this training needs to happen annually.
Okay.
You can't just do it once and assume everyone remembers everything.
Right.
Regular refreshers are key.
All right, so we've covered monitoring, audiometric testing, and training. What's the final piece of this OSHA puzzle?
The last, but definitely not least element is hearing protection itself.
Okay.
Employers are required to provide appropriate hearing protection devices, or HPDs,
Right.
to all employees exposed to noise at or above the action level.
No ifs, ands, or buts. If you're working in that noisy environment, you need to be wearing hearing protection.
Right.
What are some of the options when it comes to HPDs?
The most common types are earplugs and earmuffs.
Okay.
Earplugs are those small, insertable devices that fit snugly inside the ear canal.
Right.
Great for portability and convenience.
Yeah, I always have a few pairs of those floating around.
Then you have earmuffs,
Okay.
which are those larger devices that cover the entire outer ear.
Right.
They can be more comfortable for some people, especially if they wear them for extended periods.
They look a bit like headphones.
They do.
Right.
There are also banded earplugs,
Right.
which are basically earplugs attached to a headband. These can be a good option for workers who need to be able to easily take their hearing protection on and off throughout the day.
Interesting. So there are options for different preferences and work environments.
Yes.
But how do we know if a hearing protection device is actually effective?
That's where the noise reduction rating, or NRR, comes in.
Oh.
You've probably seen that number on the packaging of HPDs.
Yes. It seems like the higher the NRR, the more noise it blocks.
In theory, yes.
Okay.
But here's the catch, that NRR is often inflated.
Wait, what? You mean the number on the label might not actually reflect the protection I'm getting on the job?
Unfortunately, that's often the case.
Whoa.
Those NRRs are determined in controlled laboratory settings.
Okay.
But in the real world,
Yeah.
things like how well the device fits, how it's worn, and even the type of noise can all affect its effectiveness.
So how do we adjust for this discrepancy?
We use a method called demerating.
Okay.
Demerating helps us adjust the NRR to get a more realistic estimate of the protection you're actually getting on the job.
So we're basically taking that NRR with a grain of salt and adjusting it downward to account for real-world factors.
Exactly.
Okay.
And there are different approaches to derating.
Okay.
OSHA recommends one method, and NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, recommends another.
So let's break down those methods.
Right.
What's OSHA's take on derating?
OSHA keeps it pretty simple.
Right.
You start with the NRR listed on the device, subtract 7,
Okay.
and then divide that number by 2.
Okay.
Essentially, you're cutting the original NRR in half after subtracting 7, giving you a more conservative estimate.
That's a significant reduction.
Yeah.
Why such a drastic adjustment?
OSHA wants to err on the side of caution
Okay.
and ensure that workers are getting adequate protection, even if they aren't wearing their hearing protection perfectly,
Right.
or if the work environment isn't ideal.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like a safety margin.
Right.
Now, what about NIOSH's derating method?
NIOSH takes a more nuanced approach and factors in the type of hearing protection device being used.
So different devices get different daring factors?
Yes.
Okay.
For earmuffs, NIOSH recommends using only 25% of the listed NRR.
Okay.
For formable foam earplugs,
Right?
they recommend using 50% of the NRR.
Okay.
And for pre-molded ribbed or rubber earplugs, they suggest using 70%.
So the derating factor varies depending on the specific type of earplug.
Precisely.
Okay.
NIOSH has conducted extensive research on the real-world effectiveness of different types of hearing protection.
Right.
And these derating factors reflect their findings.
It's amazing how much research goes into something as seemingly simple as hearing protection.
Right.
It highlights how important it is to understand these details to ensure we're truly protecting our hearing.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
We've covered a lot of ground here today.
we have.
From the basics of noise and how our ears work, to OSHA's requirements for hearing conservation programs and the intricacies of derating hearing protection devices.
That's a lot.
What do you think is the most important takeaway for our listeners so far?
I think the most important thing to remember is that noise-induced hearing loss is completely preventable. We can protect our hearing and enjoy a lifetime of good sound by understanding the risks,
Right.
following OSHA's guidelines, and using hearing protection correctly.
Well said.
Okay.
Now, before we move on to the next part of our discussion,
Yeah.
I want to ask our listeners a question.
Okay.
Think about your own workplace.
Okay.
What kind of noise are you exposed to on a daily basis?
Yeah.
Are you taking the necessary steps to protect your hearing?
That's a great question to ponder.
Yeah.
And while you're thinking about that, we'll be back in the next part of this episode to dig deeper into some of the limitations of traditional approaches to hearing conservation and explore some exciting new developments in this field.
See you soon.
Sounds good.
All right. Bye.
Bye. Welcome back to Key Safety Talks.
Mm-hmm.
I hope you've had a chance to reflect on the noise levels in your own workplace. It's amazing how much noise we're often exposed to without even realizing it.
It's true. And one of the biggest challenges with noise-induced hearing loss is that it often develops gradually.
Right.
You might not even notice any changes until the damage is already done.
Yeah, it's that sneaky aspect we talked about earlier. But we can't just wait around for problems to develop.
Absolutely not. That's why those hearing conservation programs are so crucial.
Right.
The monitoring, testing, training, and hearing protection, all those elements work together to protect workers' hearing.
But even with the best program in place, there's always room for improvement.
Yeah.
I mean, our sources hint that there are some concerns about the limitations of traditional approaches to hearing conservation.
You're picking up on a crucial point.
Okay.
One area that has come under scrutiny is the standard threshold shift, or STS.
Right, the STS,
Yeah.
that's how we determine if someone's experienced a significant change in their hearing,
Right.
a possible red flag for noise-induced hearing loss.
Exactly. But the STS has a big drawback. It's a lagging indicator.
Lagging indicator. What does that mean in plain English?
It means that by the time we detect an STS, significant damage might have already happened. We're essentially playing catch-up instead of preventing the problem.
So it's not as preventative as we'd like it to be. More of a reactive measure after the fact.
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay.
And this isn't a new concern. Back in the late 1980s,
Okay.
a prominent audiologist,
Right.
Dr. Alice Suter, raised this very issue.
What were some of Dr. Suter's observations? She seems like someone who really knew her stuff.
She was.
Yeah.
Dr. Suter found that even with hearing conservation programs in place, some workers exposed to noise were still experiencing hearing loss.
Oh, wow.
And even more concerning,
Okay.
she noted that many employers didn't have effective ways to evaluate how well their programs were actually working.
So even though these programs existed,
Yeah.
there wasn't a clear way to measure their success in preventing hearing loss.
Precisely. If we're not accurately measuring outcomes, how can we be sure our interventions are actually making a difference?
It's like trying to hit a target blindfolded.
Yeah,
You need feedback to know if you're on track.
that's a great analogy. Now, to address these limitations, another method was developed.
Yep.
Audiometric database analysis, or ADBA.
ADBA, right?
Yeah.
I remember seeing that term in our sources, but what does it actually involve?
The idea behind ADBA was to provide a more robust way to analyze audiometric data
Okay.
and measure the effectiveness of hearing conservation programs.
Right.
Instead of focusing only on individual shifts in hearing,
Mhm.
ADBA looks at patterns and trends in hearing data over time, taking a broader perspective.
So it's like zooming out and looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Okay.
By analyzing data from larger groups of workers, the hope was that we could get a clearer picture of how noise exposure was impacting hearing and whether interventions were truly effective.
That's promising. Did ADBA live up to the hype?
Well, that's where things get a little complicated,
Okay.
despite its good intentions.
Right.
ADBA faced some significant hurdles.
Well,
Numerous studies were conducted to evaluate its effectiveness,
okay.
and the results were, shall we say, mixed.
Oh, that doesn't sound good. What were some of the issues that cropped up?
One major finding was that there was very little agreement between the different ADBA procedures.
Okay.
Basically, different approaches yielded different results.
Right.
This lack of consistency raised serious concerns about the reliability of ADBA as a measurement tool.
So it wasn't as cut and dried as researchers hoped it would be. Were there other problems?
Yes. Another challenge was the significant impact of pre-existing hearing loss.
Right. Not all hearing loss is due to noise on the job.
Right.
People come in with hearing loss from all sorts of things.
Yeah.
Age, genetics, medical conditions, even loud concerts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it turns out that pre-existing hearing loss could really throw off ADBA results.
Oh.
It made it difficult to pinpoint whether changes in hearing were truly due to occupational noise exposure or something else entirely.
So it's like trying to solve a mystery with too many suspects.
Exactly.
Okay.
Because of these limitations, ADBA hasn't been widely adopted by industry or regulatory agencies.
It's a shame that it didn't quite work out as planned.
Yeah.
It seems like finding a reliable way to measure the effectiveness of hearing conservation programs is still a major challenge.
You're right. But on a more positive note,
Yeah.
there are some exciting developments happening in the world of hearing conservation that are pushing us in the right direction.
Ooh, tell me more.
One area that's generating a lot of buzz is the use of technology to improve hearing conservation practices.
Technology to the rescue. What kind of tech are we talking about?
Well, one example is the development of tablet-based audiometry.
So instead of those big, clunky audiometers,
Yeah.
we can use tablets to conduct hearing tests.
Precisely. And this opens up a lot of possibilities.
Okay.
For starters, it makes hearing tests more accessible.
Right.
You can bring the test to the workers instead of having to send them to a clinic.
That's a game changer, especially for industries like construction or mining, where workers might be spread out over large areas.
Absolutely. And
That-
tablet-based audiometry can often be self-administered.
Wait, so employees can actually do their own hearing tests?
In many cases, yes. Of course, there's still oversight from a qualified professional.
Right.
But the employee can go through the test steps on their own using the tablet.
Okay.
It's much less intimidating for some people.
That's amazing.
Hmm.
It really puts the power in the hands of the worker.
Exactly. Another area where we're seeing incredible progress is in data management and analysis.
So we're talking about how we handle all that data from the hearing tests.
Right. Managing and analyzing large amounts of audiometric data used to be a very manual and time-consuming process.
Spreadsheets, paper files. not exactly the most efficient way to do things.
You got it. But now we have cloud-based data management systems that can handle all of that for us.
Cloud-based, so everything is stored securely online.
Exactly. These systems make it so much easier to access data from anywhere, track individual employee hearing over time,
Right.
identify trends, and evaluate the effectiveness of hearing conservation programs.
It sounds like a much more streamlined and effective approach.
It is. And some of these systems are even incorporating advanced data analytics and machine learning algorithms.
Whoa, AI getting involved in hearing
Yeah.
conservation. That's pretty impressive.
It is. These algorithms can help identify patterns and trends that humans might miss.
Okay.
And they can be used to develop predictive models,
Okay.
helping us identify workers who might be at higher risk for developing hearing loss in the future.
That's amazing. It sounds like we're moving from being reactive to being proactive.
Precisely. It's all about using technology to improve our understanding of noise-induced hearing loss and create more effective prevention strategies.
I'm really excited about the possibilities these new technologies offer.
Yeah.
But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I want to circle back to the standard threshold shift.
Okay.
We talked about its limitations.
Right.
But it's still a key metric used by OSHA. Can you remind us how the STS is calculated and what it actually tells us?
Of course. The STS measures the change in an employee's hearing threshold compared to their baseline audiogram. We're specifically looking at the average hearing level at 3 key frequencies.
Okay.
2,000 hertz,
Okay.
3,000 hertz, and 4,000 hertz in each ear.
Why those particular frequencies? Is there something special about them?
Those frequencies fall within the range of human speech.
Hmm.
A shift in those frequencies can make it harder to understand conversations, which is obviously a big problem.
So that's why OSHA uses the STS as a trigger for further action.
Yeah.
If an employee has an STS, it means their hearing has changed significantly, and it could be due to noise exposure on the job.
Exactly. To calculate the STS,
Okay.
we compare the employee's current audiogram to their baseline audiogram.
Okay.
If the average hearing threshold at those 3 frequencies, 2,000, 3,000, and 4,000 hertz, has increased by 10 decibels or more in either ear, that's considered an STS.
Okay, so it's a pretty straightforward calculation. What happens if an employee does show an STS?
First, the employer needs to inform the employee about the results of their audiogram
Okay.
and explain what an STS means.
So clear communication is crucial.
Absolutely. The employee needs to understand that their hearing has changed and that it could be related to noise exposure at work.
Right.
Then the employer needs to take steps to evaluate the situation further.
What kind of steps are we talking about?
They might start by reviewing the employee's work history and noise exposure records
Okay.
to see if there's a connection between their job tasks and the hearing shift.
Okay.
They might also refer the employee for a medical evaluation by a hearing specialist.
So it's about getting a professional opinion and ruling out other potential causes.
Exactly. Based on those evaluations, the employer needs to take appropriate actions to protect the employee's hearing.
Okay.
That could involve providing additional hearing protection,
Oh, yeah.
modifying job tasks to reduce noise exposure,
Right.
or even reassigning them to a quieter role.
So a range of solutions tailored to the specific situation.
Right.
Now, you mentioned earlier that age can play a role in hearing loss.
Yeah.
How does that factor into the STS calculation?
You're right. As we age, it's normal for our hearing to decline somewhat. It's called presbycusis,
Okay.
which is just a fancy term for age-related hearing loss.
Presbycusis. I'll try to remember that one.
To account for this natural hearing loss,
Right.
OSHA allows for an age correction factor to be applied when calculating the STS.
So we're basically adjusting the STS threshold to factor in the expected hearing loss due to age.
Exactly. OSHA provides a table with specific age correction values that can be applied based on the employee's age and the frequency being tested.
It sounds pretty standardized.
Mm.
Is using this age correction factor mandatory?
Actually, it's optional.
Oh.
Employers can choose whether or not to use it,
Okay.
and they should consult with a qualified professional to make that decision.
Why is it optional? Are there pros and cons to using it?
There are. On one hand, using the age correction factor can help prevent older workers from being unfairly penalized.
Right.
If they have some age-related hearing loss that's not due to noise exposure, using the correction factor can make sure they're not mistakenly identified as having an STS.
So it's like leveling the playing field and preventing discrimination based on age.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But on the other hand,
Uh.
using the age correction factor could make the SPS less sensitive as an early warning sign of noise-induced hearing loss.
I see. It might mask some of those subtle changes that could be a red flag. It seems like there are trade-offs to consider.
You're right. It's a decision that needs to be made carefully,
Right.
taking all the relevant factors into account.
So it's not as simple as just plugging in numbers.
Right.
You need to think about the individual worker and their specific circumstances.
Exactly.
We've talked a lot about OSHA's role in hearing conservation, but there are other organizations involved in this field as well, right?
Yes.
I know our sources mentioned OSHA.
You're absolutely right. NAOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, plays a critical role.
Okay.
They're a federal agency that's part of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention,
Right.
and they're all about preventing work-related illnesses and injuries.
So they were like the science detectives of occupational health.
That's like a great way to put it.
Thanks.
NOSH conducts research and makes recommendations to improve workplace safety and health.
Okay.
And their work is highly respected,
Mm-hmm.
often influencing OSHA's decisions.
So they're like the trusted advisors in the world of occupational safety and health.
Exactly. And they've done a lot of valuable work in the area of hearing conservation,
Okay.
particularly in noise measurement, hearing protection, and audiometric testing.
So they're providing the scientific foundation for a lot of what OSHA regulates.
Exactly. One area where their recommendations have been particularly influential is in the degrading of hearing protection devices.
Degrading, right. We talked about that earlier.
Yeah.
It's all about adjusting those noise reduction ratings to reflect real-world conditions.
You got it. Those NRRs are based on laboratory testing,
Right.
which doesn't always accurately reflect how well a device performs in a noisy workplace.
Right. Things like how well the device fits, how it's worn, and even the type of noise can all affect how much protection it provides.
That's why IOH developed those specific de-rating factors based on their research.
Yeah.
They're taking the science a step further and providing more practical guidance.
So they're helping to bridge the gap between the lab and the real world.
Exactly.
Okay, their de-rating methods are widely used by safety professionals across various industries.
They are. Now, going back to those exciting new developments we were talking about, like tablet-based audiometry and advanced data analytics, where do you see the field of hearing conservation heading in the future?
That's a great question. It seems like we're on the verge of a major shift in how we approach hearing conservation.
I agree. We're moving away from those traditional reactive approaches and embracing more proactive, data-driven strategies.
It's all about using technology and data to our advantage to prevent hearing loss.
Exactly. And I think one of the most promising areas is the development of new metrics for measuring the effectiveness of hearing conservation programs.
Right. We talked about the limitations of the standard threshold shift and audiometric database analysis. It sounds like we need a more reliable and sensitive way to assess these programs.
Absolutely. And researchers are hard at work developing new metrics that can give us a clearer picture of what's actually happening with hearing health trends over time.
So we're moving beyond those simple pass-fail thresholds and digging deeper into the data to get a more nuanced understanding.
Precisely. One metric that's gaining traction is the DBW metric.
The DBW metric. I don't think I've come across that one before.
It's relatively new.
Okay.
It was developed by Dr. James Craner,
Okay.
an occupational medicine physician.
So it's coming from the medical side of things.
Yes. The DBW metric was specifically designed to statistically quantify the magnitude and direction of noise-induced hearing loss trends over time,
Okay.
both in individuals and in groups.
So it's not just about individual cases. It's about looking at the bigger picture to see if there are patterns or trends emerging.
Exactly. And what makes the DBW metric even more powerful is that it's integrated into a software platform called WebOSCAR.
WebOSCAR. Interesting.
It's a web-based system that streamlines the process of managing health and safety compliance data,
Okay.
including audiometric data. It makes all that complex data much more accessible and user-friendly.
So instead of wrestling with spreadsheets, employers can use this software to get a clear and concise picture of their employees' hearing health.
That's the idea. With the DBW metric built into the system, employers can track hearing health trends in their workforce, spot potential issues early on, and take steps to prevent further hearing loss.
That's incredible. It sounds like a real game changer for preventing noise-induced hearing loss.
It has the potential to be, and I think it's just the beginning of what's possible as technology keeps evolving.
Right.
We're going to see even more innovative tools and approaches to hearing conservation.
It's a really exciting time to be in this field.
It is.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our discussion,
Okay.
I'd like to ask our listeners another question.
Okay.
What stands out to you as the most significant challenge in hearing conservation?
That's a great question to ponder. And while you're thinking about that, we'll be back in the next part of this episode to explore some real-world examples and case studies that bring the importance of hearing conservation to life.
See you soon.
Yeah.
Welcome back to Key Safety Talks.
Yeah.
I hope you had a chance to think about the challenges we face in hearing conservation. It's a complex issue.
Right.
But one thing that struck me is how easy it is to take our hearing for granted until it's too late.
You've hit the nail on the head. We often don't realize how precious our hearing is until we start to lose it.
Yeah.
And unlike some injuries, noise-induced hearing loss is irreversible.
It's a stark reminder. The prevention is absolutely key.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you had some real-world examples and case studies that really highlight the importance of hearing conservation.
Right.
I'd love to hear them. I think those kinds of stories can really bring this issue to life.
I agree. Sometimes it takes hearing about someone's personal experience to make us realize just how serious this issue is.
Right.
One industry that's been hit hard by noise-induced hearing loss is construction.
That makes sense. Construction sites are notoriously noisy.
You're right. Think about all the equipment they use. Jackhammers, power saws, heavy machinery.
Yeah.
Those tools generate extremely high noise levels,
All right.
far above OSHA's action level.
And if those workers aren't consistently wearing their hearing protection?
The consequences can be devastating. I remember reading a case study about a construction worker who had been on the job for over 20 years.
Wow, 20 years of exposure to that kind of noise.
Yeah.
That must have taken a toll.
He didn't always wear his hearing protection.
Yeah.
Thinking he was tough enough to handle the noise.
The invincibility myth. We all think it can't happen to us.
Unfortunately, it's a common misconception.
Yeah.
Over time, that noise exposure caught up with him. He started having trouble hearing conversations, especially in noisy environments.
Yeah, those are some of the classic early warning signs of hearing loss.
Exactly. As it progressed, it began to affect his work.
Right.
He struggled to communicate with his coworkers,
Right.
understand instructions, and even hear warning signals on the job site.
So it became a safety issue, not just a health issue.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hearing loss can significantly increase the risk of accidents on a construction site.
Sure.
If you can't hear a warning shout or the backup alarm of a truck, you're in real danger.
Right. It's a scary thought.
Yeah.
It's not just about protecting your hearing for your personal well-being. It's also about ensuring your safety and the safety of those around you.
You're right. Sadly, in this case, the worker eventually had to leave his job because his hearing loss became so severe.
It's heartbreaking. He lost his livelihood because of something that could have been prevented.
Exactly. And it wasn't just his work that was affected.
Right.
His hearing loss had a ripple effect on his personal life as well.
Yeah.
Talking on the phone, watching TV,
Yeah.
even just communicating with his family became a challenge.
It's a powerful reminder that hearing loss isn't just an occupational issue, it's a quality of life issue.
Well said. Now, construction is certainly one of the noisier industries,
Yeah.
but it's not the only one where workers are at risk.
I was just thinking about that manufacturing probably has its fair share of noise hazards.
You bet. Manufacturing environments can be incredibly loud.
Right.
You've got machinery running at high speeds, creating a constant din.
What are some of the loudest jobs in a typical manufacturing setting?
Working with stamping presses, grinders, and welders are known for being particularly loud.
Those sound intense.
They are even jobs that might not seem as loud,
Yeah.
like operating forklifts or working near conveyor belts, can contribute to noise exposure over time.
It all adds up, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I imagine the consequences of noise-induced hearing loss are similar to what we saw in the construction industry.
Exactly. Difficulty communicating, safety hazards, reduced quality of life, those are all potential outcomes.
Yeah.
But in manufacturing, there's another layer of complexity: ototoxic chemicals.
Ototoxic chemicals. Those are new to me.
They're chemicals that can damage the inner ear, specifically those delicate hair cells we talked about earlier.
So it's not just noise that can cause problems. There's
Right.
certain chemicals as well.
That's right.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, many manufacturing processes involve using ototoxic chemicals.
Okay.
Some common examples include solvents, heavy metals like lead and mercury,
Right.
and some pesticides.
Wow, that's a lot of potential hazards to be aware of.
It is, and to make matters even more challenging,
Okay.
exposure to both noise and ototoxic chemicals can create a synergistic effect.
Synergistic. Does that mean they make each other worse?
Exactly. The combined exposure can amplify the damage to the inner ear, potentially leading to more severe and rapid hearing loss.
So it's a double whammy.
Right.
That makes it even more important for manufacturing facilities to have comprehensive hearing conservation programs that address both noise and chemical hazards.
You're absolutely right. It's about taking a holistic approach to protecting workers' hearing.
For sure.
Now, let's switch gears for a moment and talk about an industry that often gets overlooked when we think about noise-induced hearing loss.
Healthcare.
Healthcare. Really, I wouldn't think of hospitals as being particularly noisy places.
You might be surprised. While hospitals aren't typically as loud as construction sites or factories,
Right.
they still have plenty of noise sources that can pose a risk to workers' hearing.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are some examples of noise hazards in a hospital?
Think about all the alarms and alerts that are constantly going off.
Right.
Beeping monitors, ringing phones, call bells.
That's true.
Right.
It's a different type of noise.
But it's still noise.
Exactly. And then you have equipment like suction pumps, ventilators, and even dental drills that can create quite a racket.
Ah, I see. It's a reminder that noise hazards can lurk in the most unexpected places.
Yeah.
Are there particular roles in healthcare that are more vulnerable to noise-induced hearing loss?
Yes, some roles have higher exposure than others.
Okay.
For example, operating room nurses and technicians are often exposed to high noise levels from surgical equipment.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Those operating rooms can be pretty high-tech and intense.
And then you have dentists and dental hygienists who use high-speed drills on a daily basis.
Those drills are definitely not quiet.
Not at all. Even using ultrasound machines, which
Yeah.
are common in many healthcare settings,
Right.
can contribute to noise exposure over time.
It seems like it's essential for healthcare facilities to take noise hazards seriously and implement proper hearing conservation measures.
Yeah,
Even if it might not be the first thing that comes to mind.
you're absolutely right. It's a good reminder that we need to be vigilant about noise hazards in all work environments, not just the ones that are stereotypically loud.
Right.
Yeah.
We've covered so much ground today exploring noise hazards across a wide range of industries.
Yeah, we have.
What do you think are the most important takeaways from these real-world examples?
I think these stories really drive home the point that noise-induced hearing loss is a widespread problem that can affect anyone in any industry.
Right. It's not just a problem for construction workers or factory workers.
Yes.
It can happen to anyone exposed to excessive noise over time.
Exactly. And because hearing loss often develops gradually,
Yeah.
we need to be proactive and take steps to protect our hearing before it's too late.
Prevention is paramount. What are the most important things we can do to protect our hearing, both on the job and in our personal lives?
The first step is awareness. We need to be mindful of the fact that noise exposure,
Yeah.
even at levels that might not seem that loud,
Mm-hmm.
can damage our hearing over time.
Once we're aware of the risks, what concrete actions can we take?
Wearing hearing protection whenever we're exposed to loud noises is crucial.
Right.
And not just any hearing protection.
Yeah.
It's important to choose the right type for the situation and make sure we're wearing it properly.
Right. A poorly fitted or improperly worn device isn't going to do much good.
Exactly. We can also advocate for quieter work environments.
Yeah.
That might mean talking to supervisors or safety representatives about noise levels, suggesting engineering controls like quieter equipment,
Yep.
or even just requesting that noisy tasks be scheduled for times when fewer workers are present.
It sounds like there's a lot we can do, both individually and collectively, to reduce noise exposure and protect our hearing.
There is. And if you're an employer,
Right.
remember that it's your responsibility to provide a safe and healthy work environment for your employees.
Yeah.
And that includes protecting their hearing.
That means going above and beyond the minimum OSHA requirements and making hearing conservation a top priority.
Absolutely. Finally, I encourage everyone to get regular hearing checkups, even if you don't think you have any problems.
Early detection is so important.
It is. Remember, protecting your hearing is an investment in your long-term health and well-being.
Well said. It sounds like we all have a role to play in preventing noise-induced hearing loss.
Right.
And by working together, we can make a real difference.
I hope our discussion today has helped to raise awareness about this often overlooked occupational hazard and giving you some practical tips for protecting your hearing.
Thanks for all the great information and insights.
You're welcome.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us on Key Safety Talks.
Yeah.
Remember, protecting your hearing is one of the best things you can do for your long-term health and happiness.
Until next time, stay safe.
Sounds good.